Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something absolutely massive. We're unpacking one of the most high-stakes, dramatic, and literally game-changing ideological clashes in modern history. We're talking about the 1930s, the intellectual battleground where two absolute titans, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi, went head-to-head. As we'll see, their deeply held beliefs about society, representation, and equality basically collided at the Round Table conferences, and it forever changed the trajectory of modern India. Let's get right into it. Okay, so let's set the stakes. How did India's marginalized communities fight for their very first political voice on an international stage? Because, we aren't just talking about your run-of-the-mill political debate here. This was the struggle to draft the actual blueprint of a nation's future. How do you build a constitution that genuinely includes all voices, especially the ones that had been actively silenced for centuries? Getting millions of marginalized people a literal seat at the table globally, that was an unprecedented challenge. And it's exactly the monumental question we're answering today. So, part one, what actually was the Round Table Conference? Let's jump back to the early 1930s. Between 1930 and 1932, the British government held this series of meetings in London to hash out India's political future. Now notice the name, Round Table. That wasn't just, a description of the furniture. It was a very deliberate symbolic choice. A round table doesn't have a head or a foot, right? It's literally meant to symbolize total equality among everyone sitting there. But man, we have to acknowledge the painful irony here. You've got this table designed for perfect equality sitting in some fancy room in London, while back in India, severe, institutionalized inequality was just the daily reality for millions of people. Which perfectly brings us to our next section, Dr. Ambedkar's main demands. Dr. Ambedkar was invited to pull up a chair to that London table specifically to represent the depressed classes, which was the term used back then for the Dalit community. To really understand his demands, we have to look at the incredibly harsh human realities he carried with him. We're talking about inhuman treatment in everyday life, being barred from entering temples, facing massive roadblocks in education, even being blocked from using public wells. Dr. Ambedkar looked at this deeply rooted prejudice and basically concluded that the Dalit community simply could not rely on the goodwill of the Hindu majority to protect them. They needed absolute ironclad guarantees. And this brilliantly illustrates his core philosophical motivation. Check out this quote. "Political power is the key to social upliftment." He was totally convinced that you can't just ask for social equality as some kind of favor. No way. It has to be codified into law. For Ambedkar, fighting discrimination at the village well or the temple doors, that was literally impossible unless you first had a solid grip on political power in the legislative assembly. For him, political representation wasn't just a nice-to-have goal. It was an absolute survival tool. So what exactly was he asking for? Well, here are his core demands mapped out. He wanted guaranteed representation in the assembly, fair shots at government jobs, and legal protections in education. But the absolute top priority on this list, his ultimate, non-negotiable demand, was separate electorates for Dalits. He felt this was the one foolproof mechanism to ensure his community could elect leaders who actually had their backs, without those voices getting diluted or controlled by the broader majority. And that specific demand leads us right into the central conflict of this explainer, the Gandhi-Ambedkar ideological struggle. As we look at this, remember, we're impartially analyzing a clash between two towering figures. Now, what's really fascinating about this slide is how perfectly it captures the total disconnect between their worldviews. On one side, Dr. Ambedkar is arguing for immediate, concrete protection. His stance? Dalits cannot be left to the mercy of broader society. Upper caste Hindus can't truly represent them, so they absolutely need separate electorates to choose their own leaders. Period. But then on the flip side, Mahatma Gandhi is looking at this entirely through the lens of social unity. He deeply believed Dalits were an integral and separable part of Hindu society. For Gandhi, granting separate electorates would permanently fracture the community, creating a political divide that could, in his eyes, never be healed. Section 3. The Communal Award and the Fast. Let's slow things down a bit here, because this is where the theoretical debate turns into a literal life-or-death crisis. Take a look at this timeline and just see how incredibly fast this escalated. 1930, Dr. Ambedkar participates in the first conference. 1931, second conference, and the ideological clash with Gandhi is now front and center. Fast forward to August 1932, and the British basically side with Ambedkar's logic, announcing the communal award which grants those separate electorates. Literally weeks later, in September, Gandhi starts a massive protest against it. And by late September,
The entire political landscape is forced into a sudden, drastic resolution with the Poona Pact.
Let's move to these steps and see how this turned into an absolute pressure cooker. Step 1. British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald announces the Communal Award. Step 2. Mahatma Gandhi, seeing this as a catastrophic division of society, begins a fast unto death in Yerwada jail. Step 3. Imagine the tension here. An intensely emotional atmosphere completely grips the entire nation. Gandhi is beloved and his health is fading fast. Which brings us to Step 4. Dr. Ambedkar is suddenly bearing an unimaginable burden. He has to weigh the political survival of his own people against the very life of Mahatma Gandhi, not to mention the massive public backlash that would hit if Gandhi were to actually die. This agonizing dilemma brings us to our next section, the historic Poona Pact. Facing this massive crisis, the leaders went into desperate negotiations, and the Poona Pact became the ultimate middle ground. It was built entirely on a huge concession and a huge gain. The concession? Dr. Ambedkar agreed to completely drop the demand for separate electorates, which satisfied Gandhi's strict requirement for a unified joint electorate. But the gain? In exchange for giving that up, the number of reserved seats specifically guaranteed for Dalits in the provincial legislatures was massively increased. It was a highly pragmatic compromise. It saved Gandhi's life, but it still secured a real, tangible, mathematical increase in political representation for Ambedkar's constituents. Now, before we wrap up, it's worth taking a quick second to clarify a historical misconception you might sometimes hear about this period. There's this idea that Dr. Ambedkar was met with widespread Black Flag protests over in London. But actually, the mainstream historical record doesn't really show solid proof of that happening at the London conferences. However, it is absolutely true that back in India, these intense disagreements sparked heavy protests. Supporters and opponents of both leaders had incredibly strong feelings as this played out, which really just highlights how deeply personal and critical these issues were to the everyday public.
Finally, let's move to our last section, the long-term impacts of the conference.
So the crucial point here is understanding the legacy of all this. As the dust settled, Indian politics was totally changed. First, the Dalit question was no longer just a hidden domestic issue, it was officially recognized on the international stage. Second, Dr. Ambedkar cemented his status, not just as a representative for his community, but as a major, undeniable national leader. Third, the Poona Pact set a massive precedent for political negotiation in the country, and maybe most importantly, this whole intense clash laid the absolute structural foundation for the modern system of political reservations that still exists in India today. Which leaves us with this final, really vital question to think about. How does the foundation laid by that frantic, high-stakes compromise in 1932 continue to shape the debates around representation, equity, and reservations in our society right now? Because the tension between community-specific representation and national unity, that didn't just magically disappear in 1932. It evolved. Understanding this history is absolutely key to understanding the politics of today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.